All right, today we're going to be talking about 110 film photography and specifically a review of the new LOMOMATIC 110 camera. I really like this camera, and we're going to talk about the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly regarding this camera, and I'm going to compare and contrast it to two of my favorite cameras, the Canon 110 ED and the Canon 110 ED20. This camera, being a creation in 2024, is outstanding. Lomography back in 2012 made a commitment to keep 110 film going. I always applaud that. They have a variety of different emulsions available in 110, from black and white to color negative. I really like the black and white film, the Orca. It is a 100 speed black and white cine film. It's actually Oro UN54, just loaded in Lomography's cassettes. It's a beautiful, beautiful black and white film, really classic quality. And the color negative film that I like, the Tiger 200, really beautiful film. It's got to be some Kodak stock because it's made in America, but I really like the look and feel of those two stocks. It's what I've primarily been shooting. I have been testing, part of a larger exhibition that I'll get into in a future post here. So let's talk about this camera. First off, what I like is it comes in two versions. This is the metal version, and there is a plastic version. The metal version is nice. It feels good to the hand. It's got a nice quality feel to it. It doesn't feel anywhere near as luxurious as, say, a Canon 110-20, but this camera in 2024 costs $150. This camera in 2024 from 1997, adjusted for inflation, would be about $500. This was a really expensive luxury 110 camera back in 75 and 77. So that aside, the camera doesn't feel inexpensive though. It's very lightweight, much lighter weight than my Canons are, and it's very comfortable to travel around with. The camera has a battery compartment here on the back, and it runs on a very affordable and very easy to find CR2 battery. I love the fact that the battery is not some esoteric one that's difficult to get to. Camera has a wrist strap on the side. It comes with this little slanky wrist strap. Not a big fan of that. I've got a leather one that I put on as I kind of prefer it. It has a detachable flash. I bought the one that has the detachable flash version. I don't use the flash a lot with 110, but it's nice to know that I have it if I need it. It has two different flash settings, one for daytime, one for nighttime, and the flash is powered by that same CR2 battery on the side. To open the camera up, you simply pull it across. And that's also how you advance the film after you take a shot. Now, if you remember, I posted a previous video on how to use the shutter on this camera, and I'll reiterate that really quickly right now. The shutter on this camera is a button here on the top. When you push it, it's kind of like a hair shutter. It's a very gentle push, and you can hear on a lot of cases the shutter open and sometimes close, depending on how long your exposure is. But you have to keep pushing down in order for the film to release. So if I'm going to take a picture, there's the shutter, there's the release, and then I can advance the film. I've seen countless videos online where people are having that problem. Once again, just remember that the first clicks you're hearing are the shutter. There's a deeper push that is for the release. Now, one thing that I have found about working with this camera, the way that I like to use it is like a hair trigger. I hold the camera steady, I'll do the shutter, and then I'll push down to do the advance. I don't like to do it all in a single action because I'm trying to avoid camera shake if I can help that. On top of the camera, it has a very simple layout menu. It has three different choices for ISO. You have 100, 200, 400, and this is really great because anybody who remembers vintage 110 cameras, most of them were set for ISO 100. The Canon cameras were set for ISO 80, and that was it on the 110 ED, and later on when Kodak introduced 400 speed 110 film, they came out with the ED20 that allowed you to use both films. But the film ISO was controlled on the cassette itself and not on the camera. The cassette had a cutout on the side notch that would tell the camera if it had 100 or 400 speed. What's great about the Lomo setup is that I can dial in between these three whenever I want on the same roll, and that's awesome for backlight exposure. Let's say I'm taking a picture. Let's say you're taking a picture of me right now. I'm backlit back here with all this light. Let's say I've got the 200 speed Tiger film loaded in here. All I would have to do is change the ISO to 100, and that's going to overexpose the film by an entire stop. and it's going to give me backlight compensation. I have found that this works outstanding. Of course, I could always use the flash as well. And I find the flash feels natural. It doesn't feel overly powerful. It does just put off a nice amount of fill life. All right, quick creative tip with the flash. So the flash is small. And let's say you're gonna take a picture at night, you've got a friend, you're in the city, they're standing somewhere on a sidewalk. The flash is gonna illuminate them properly. But a lot of the ambient area, the area around them, the ambient light, isn't really gonna be that influenced in the frame unless you leave the shutter open for a longer period of time. The way you do that is on the top of the camera, turn on bulb exposure. Flash is turned on. You can see the green ready light is ready. So what I would do is take the shot, flash will fire, and I'm leaving my finger depressed. And during these couple of seconds, cars are going by, all sorts of stuff is happening. I'm moving a little bit. The light's getting really great creative light streaks. And then when I'm happy, I release the shutter and the shutter closes. Give it a shot. But I like the ability of using the ISO once again to better control and hone in what I want the exposure to be. It also has a bulb setting on the top, so it is possible to do exposures out to 30 seconds on this camera in auto mode or in manual bulb mode. That's kind of cool. But the one thing that's missing is they didn't put a tripod socket on the camera. I'm on the fence about that. I don't use a tripod very often. I don't mind hand holding 20, 30-second exposures. Some of that is part of an aesthetic and a look that I personally have. What's interesting though is the Canon cameras that I have, not only do they have a tripod socket, but they even have a cable release on the top, which is kind of bananas. I mean, Canon put an awful lot into these cameras in 75 and 77. So it doesn't have a tripod socket, it doesn't have a cable release, and it doesn't have a self-timer. I wish it at least had a self-timer setting. That would have been kind of nice. I could always have rested this on top of something, but you know, I'm not going to ding Lomo for that because I don't think that's really that big a deal, once again, for the style of shooting that I plan on doing with this camera. The camera has different focus settings on the front. Anybody who's familiar with an LCA camera will be very familiar with this. It's scale focus. It has everything from 0.8, 1.5, 3, and infinity. Those are all in meters. So 0.8 is like 2.6 feet. 1.5 is about 5 feet, 3 is about 10 feet, and infinity obviously is infinity. That's not a bad range. My Canon cameras are a rangefinder, like a Leica. You've actually got a split image on the inside, and they'll focus down to 2 feet. But I do find that the scale focus is very quick and very easy to walk around with, but I'll talk more about that scale focus in just a minute. The camera has 2 f-stops. It has f2.8 and f5.6. And that's indicated here on the bottom. There's a switch for day, which is 5.6, and night, which is 2.8. Now, my personal preference is to use 2.8 as often as possible. I only use the 5.6 if I really feel I have to. And here's the reason why. The f2.8 is a perfectly circular opening. So you're going to have the nicest rendering. I'm not saying it's going to be the sharpest edge to edge, top to bottom, but it's going to be a nicer rendering. When you go to 5.6, and by the way, the Canons are exactly the same, the aperture is kind of like this diamond shape. And I don't love the rendering as much. So I personally try to shoot this camera as often as possible with the 2.8 setting. So I use it even in the daytime. That does mean, however, that I will be overexposing. The max shutter speed on this camera is only a 250th of a second. So depending on the film that you have loaded, you are quite often going to be overexposing film. However, that doesn't really matter that much because all the color negative material and even the black and white film that's available for this camera currently, all was totally fine being overexposed by 1 or 2 stops. I have had no problem whatsoever scanning the materials using this particular camera. It has a multiple exposure switch on the bottom. Thank you, Lomo, for putting a multiple exposure switch in. I love that. And I love it for a couple of reasons. One, if I want to do a multiple exposure, it's great. 2, if I'm using a film that doesn't have sprocket holes, I'm able to still advance the film and then recock the shutter manually to take shots. There are a lot of people who like to bulk load 110 film. It's something that we will talk about in future videos, and that is one way of getting around film that doesn't have sprocket holes that would cock the shutter. So overall, everything about this camera really kind of hit all the marks for what I want. The viewfinder is pretty basic. It's kind of centered on the scene that you're going to be getting. You definitely get a little more on the bottom than you would expect. And you do get a bigger frame than 13 by 17. I'm going to show that right here in an example. So what you're seeing right now are two images. One image, the first image here, made with my Canon ED20. Now, once again, the ED20 is a rangefinder, so my focus is really quite perfect. I'm focused on Eve here at f2.0. And what you can see is she's in focus, and there's a really nice background out of focus quality to it. Now, if you look to the right of the image, you can see that there's a little ghosting or a little bleed through of more of the image. Now let's take a look at the LOMO negative. The LOMO negative, as you can see, has an awful lot of information that comes in on the right-hand side. And I actually kind of like that information. I kind of look at it as like a little panoramic gift where I'm getting like a little more of an image that I may or may not want to use. I always have the ability of cropping this, but there are times that what happens in that ghost image off to the left is, or excuse me, off to the right is super cool. Now the LOMO image, as you'll notice, once again, I focused on Eve, but once again, I'm only using scale focus. And what you can see is she's sharp, but she's not as sharp as the Canon, and the background is more in focus. Once again, this is a 23mm lens versus a 26mm lens on the Canon. So what I wanted to talk about briefly here is depth of field. So I went online and I was able to calculate the depth of field for 110 film using the LOMO camera. And I think this answers a lot of questions that people have been having. You know, why in some instances do my images not seem sharp with the LOMO camera? And the answer is you're probably outside of depth of field, or you push the button too hard and you had camera shake. So on the camera, I have these charts right here. If you're focused at 0.8, which is the closest focus that you can get on this camera, once again about 2.6 feet. Basically, it's from 2.47 feet to 2.78 feet. It is very shallow. So if you're doing close-up work and you're frustrated that your image isn't sharp, what it is the depth of field is so narrow at that close a distance that scale focus is difficult to be perfect on. Now, anybody who's trying to be perfect on a 110 camera is kind of missing the point a little bit, but that at least answers some of those questions. Again, another example, and I'll post these charts here in the video at the end. If I'm focused at 3 is about 10 feet, and I'm shooting at 2.8, my total depth of field is only 4.58 feet. So I've got focus from about 8 feet out to about 12.6 feet. So if you take a look at the portrait of Eve, you'll notice that that was shot at the 3 and the 2.8. You'll notice that she's right on the edge of just being maybe a little soft, a little flare on her face. And this gets into the tricky quality of working with a scale focus camera. Because unlike a rangefinder camera, where I can exactly dial in my point of focus, unless I want to literally change my composition to meet 0.8, 1.5, 3 as a focus distance, I'm always relying upon that f-stop to give me the sharpness that I want. Now, if we go to f5.6, I made that chart as well, and we were to go once again to, let's say, the 3, which is 10 feet, at f5.6, you have a total of about almost 11 feet depth of field. Big difference. 11 feet versus 4.5 feet. You get a lot more depth of field. So if you're, what these charts basically in a nutshell are going to tell you is that if you're concerned about having something in focus, you're better shooting at the f5.6. However, I don't think the rendering is as beautiful. Where you're looking for sort of more of an atmospheric sort of quality, you're looking for some out of focus rendering, you don't care that it's razor sharp, then I would go with the 2.8. That's kind of my personal preference. But once again, as I said, I'll post these charts. I hope you find them helpful. They were for me. It explained an awful lot where if something was just a little out of focus, I now know why. Generally speaking, it's a depth of field issue. I didn't gauge the distances accurate enough to be precise on the focus. So having got all that focus and stuff set aside, I really like shooting with the LOMOMATIC 110. If you're trying to be precise with this camera, you might be sort of missing the point a little bit. And let me just talk about that for a second. I look at the 110 format as a real alt process format. You know, small negative, difficult to enlarge. Your grain's going to be huge, especially if you're not careful. You're going to have issues with focus, and all of that to me is fun and playful, and it's why I want to work with a 110 system. When I'm working with my Canon systems, it's definitely more precise. If I was doing a portrait and I wanted it to be razor sharp, yeah, I'd probably use the 110. But that's not why I'm working with 110. I'm working with 110 for a more spontaneous, free way of working, a more fluid method of engaging with my subject, whether it's a landscape, whether it's a portrait, or a narrative story that I'm building. That's really what I'm working towards. So the LOMOMATIC 110 for me is an absolute winner of a camera. There's a couple of things, as I mentioned, that I wish it had had, but none of them for me are really a deal breaker. One last little tip I'll tell you is always listen for the shutter speed. Listen for the sound of the shutter opening and the shutter closing, especially if you're in low light. You know, you'll hear that first click if you're photographing in a room, and just wait until you hear the second click. I got really in tune with that working with my LCAs over the last, 25 plus years, and I find that same thing is true with this camera. I listen for the shutter because that'll inform you a lot about, what's going on with the light, how the camera's seeing it, and the quality that you're going to get in your image. Now, one final note. Eve and I, under EveNSteve, have a new exhibition that is opening right now in Pawlet, Vermont. It is an exhibition. I'm going to do a whole video on it here next on 110 film. It is the largest exhibition ever worldwide of photographs made with a 110 camera. We went to Cape Cod early May and created a series of 5 monumental artworks. I'm talking 30 feet wide, 13 feet tall, massive, massive artworks, all made with a LOMOMATIC 110 in Lomos film. It's a beautiful exhibit. There's a movie that's coming out on it in a couple of weeks. If you're in Pawlet, Vermont, the Hayfield Art Gallery is open to the public every single day of the week. It's free. You can come out, look at the works. They're very experimental, but it showcases one way to be able to work with 110. And I, for one, am really excited to continue making work with this camera going forward. Thank you very much for listening. Now go shoot some film.